thanks for coming today. We in Science Apps, when we first started getting organized 4 or 5 years ago, one of the things that we were able to do is compete for some science money from the national office to support some of the information needs that EF had for the sage-grouse listing diffusion. And a few weeks ago, about a month ago, you heard about 4 or 5 of those projects with Tom Remington that helped us pull these disparate proposals together through and evaluate them through WAFWA. One of the other things that Greg and I wanted to do was to segment some of that money off to the side, because we knew we were going to get questions about climate and sage-grouse and sagebrush. And so fortuitously for us, John Bradford was connected with the Southern Rockies LCC and through USGS. And so we started talking and to John about doing some work, and he continues to work with an old colleague of his and mine, Bill Allenroth, with the University of Wyoming. I've known Bill since I was a graduate student a long, long time ago, so up at CSU. So they put together a package of research for us to really take a look at the climate impacts on the plant community. They've done some work with sagebrush itself, and we asked them to take a look at the understory of the sagebrush system too, so that we could get an idea of the long-term persistence and distribution of sagebrush and that understory, and continue to review and assess not just sage-grouse, but as we build out to looking at the bigger system, the other kinds of wildlife and plants that may be of concern for the service in the state. So I'm going to hand the ball off to John. John works at the Southwest Biological Science Center in Flagstaff for USGS. Bill is a professor at the University of Wyoming, and Kyle Palmquist also is at the University of Wyoming, so they're going to do the tag team and run through the presentation. So thanks you guys for coming up and coming down.
Thanks for having us. As Steve mentioned, you'll hear from me. I'm John Bradford with USGS and Flagstaff. You'll also hear from Bill and Kyle, Wyoming. A fourth participant in this fairly long-term collaboration that's not here today is Daniel Schweitzer, who's now at the University of Basel, and he still contributes quite a lot to our efforts, and so he's a real part of this. So these are the topics that we want to talk about today. All the ones in white are the sort of specific research themes and questions we're going to try to address. But one of the common elements of the way we approach these questions is to think about the influence of climate and disturbance on these plant communities through an ecohydrological perspective. And so I want to start by talking about that, and I want to emphasize that approach and that method pervades all of these questions shown here in white. So really this comes out of the recognition that sagebrush ecosystems and many ecosystems in the western United States are very heterogeneous in terms of their topography and climates at fairly small scales, which means that just using relatively coarse metrics of climate may not provide adequate insight in terms of understanding the dynamics of these really heterogeneous ecosystems. And also, importantly, they're very water limited. And so what drives the system in terms of productivity and plant species composition, recovery from disturbances, competition, all these dynamics is really access to and utilization of soil water. So we try to understand these systems through the perspective of understanding soil moisture dynamics, which includes some of the drivers over this heterogeneity. So just briefly, the way that we approach this ecohydrological model, a daily time step soil water model called SOILWAT. Inputs to this model include daily weather, vegetation properties, importantly information about the soil, so soil depth and soil texture, which helps us keep track of how the water moves through the soil. Outputs include daily information, which can be aggregated up to monthly or annual values of each water balance component. Basically, all the boxes and arrows on the right, the take-home message from that is just that it keeps track of where all the water goes that comes into the system. So how much of it is intercepted by the vegetation and evaporated, how much actually gets into the soil, and if it does get into the soil, does it move through the soil profile, does it get transpired out or evaporated out? And really, importantly, see if my cursor works here. There we go. Down here is probably the part of the model that's most important and relevant, is we keep track of multiple layers of soil and how much water is in them for every day throughout the year. And this allows us to get some insight on not only when during the year is there moisture available, but also where in the soil profile. And this is these multiple layers, that's what the plants are responding to. So you can sort of ignore all the boxes and arrows and think about SOILWAT as a translation tool that helps us translate from daily information about weather and soil conditions and vegetation structure into daily metrics of water balance and water availability for plants. And it's really that water availability for plants that's most important. It's one step closer to understanding what the plants are directly responding to. So just a visual of what this looks like. This is a traditional climate diagram on the left here with mean annual with monthly temperature shown in red and monthly precipitation shown in blue. They've been generated for many decades, and they're really useful insights on the overall climatic conditions of a site. We're able to take that kind of information, although on a daily metric, put it through the model and get information like what we see on the right, which is on the y-axis there is soil depth going from near the surface here all the way down to a meter. And then this is throughout the year, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And the color relates to how much moisture is in the soil. So green is a lot of moisture, and all the way down to white is very little moisture in terms of availability. And you can see that this really highlights when the soil profile is dry throughout the whole year, or throughout the whole depth in the middle of the summer, and how it's extremely dry near the surface. So this is just a sort of visual depiction of the kind of insights we can get from this model that allows us to understand in a little more detail what the plants are really responding to. So the other nice thing about this modeling approach is it provides a really approachable synthetic tool for thinking about what the future holds. So this, I'll sort of illustrate that with this. This is typical soil moisture conditions in sagebrush ecosystems. And what I'm showing here is on the y-axis is soil water potential, so wetter in the top, drier in the bottom. And again, we've got the seasonal pattern throughout the year. The blue line is current conditions for several hundred sites that we simulated throughout the range of sagebrush. And the other colors are different future projections. So we've got the middle of the century in purple and the end of the century in black. And then we've got different shaded areas around that that really just represent different variations among the climate models that are driving this. Seems like a lot of complexity, but what's nice about this is it allows us to identify features of these curves where we're really observing changes that the uncertainty in climate is relatively small compared to the magnitude of change. So where can we be certain that things are going to really be different in the future? And I've highlighted a couple of those with these arrows here. One is that all the climate models suggest that the wintertime soils are going to be wetter than they are now. And you can see this because all these different potential futures, I really can't get this thing to respond very easily to me, all the potential futures are different than current. Likewise, we see that the summertime dry down of the soil is likely to be earlier under all the climate futures. So this allows us a tool to sort of cut through some of the uncertainty that we know exists in climate forecasts and try to identify what we have some confidence about is going to be different. So it's a nice forecasting tool for the future. All right. I think I mentioned before, but I'll just say it again. This overall ecohydrological approach in this soil water model is going to be evident in all of these topics that we're going to talk about today. So we don't necessarily go into the details like I just did for all of them, but it's there providing the foundation for all of them. So the first topic we want to talk about is using this approach to just understand the ecohydrology of sagebrush systems. So what kind of ecohydrology, what kind of water availability patterns support sagebrush ecosystems? A really relatively straightforward question. So probably everybody here knows that these big sagebrush systems are quite widespread. We define them as those that are dominated by big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, provide a lot of habitat for species we won't talk about. And this is a general picture according to one assessment of where sagebrush ecosystems tend to exist across the West. Obviously quite widely distributed. One of the challenges, we have an ecosystem type that's this broadly distributed. How do you get insight about the general features of this when it's so widely distributed? It's also important to note that there are three sort of dominant ecosystem types within the big sagebrush general category. There's shrublands, which are shown here in the greenish color. the steppe, which is shown in the orangish color, and the montane, which is shown in the blue color. Generally, the montane is higher elevation, tends to be dominated by Basiana. The other two are lower elevation and do have some distinguishing features. A couple of the studies that we'll talk about later will refer to differences among these subspecies or ecosystem types, and this just gives you a feel for a little bit about where they're distributed across the range. So the way we approached trying to understand the ecohydrology of sagebrush was to simulate soil moisture dynamics for a 50-year period at 898 sites, which all those black dots show the sites. They're spread across the range of sagebrush. They were selected to be representative of the climatic conditions that sagebrush occurs in, the soil conditions, and also the ecosystem types I just mentioned to make sure that we do a good job of representing all the variability. So this is just a quick snapshot about what we learned. Again, what I'm showing here, the top panel is soil water potential in the top 20 centimeters, and the bottom panel is deeper soils. The y-axis is soil water potential, so we have more water at the top, less water as you move down to the bottom, and then the x-axis is time through the month, so we're looking at seasonal patterns from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. I've drawn this blue box here because these are the soil water potentials at which water starts to really become restrictive for plants. So above this top blue line, generally water is pretty available and plants can access it. Below this bottom blue line, plants might still be able to get some, but there's very little left and there isn't much opportunity for transpiration. So it's kind of this transition zone between where water is available and where it's not available. The lines I'm showing here are the median condition throughout all those almost 900 sites for the top soils on the top and the bottom soils on the bottom. And the range is the range of sites for all 898. So a few key features that really typically characterize sagebrush ecosystems. First, this is really a storage-dominated water balance. If you look at the recharge, the soil moisture is increasing pretty reliably in the winter, and by the late winter, early spring, there's a very strong and consistent signal of wet soils in these systems. So you have a lot of recharge in which you start your growing season out with wet soils, both at the top and at the bottom soils, and that's really shown kind of by that purple area there. This is because of this cool season recharge of soil water. If you don't get that cool season recharge, those kind of places don't support sagebrush. The other thing that's fairly common is we see fairly reliable summer dry period in the top soil layers. So if you can see this orange arrow here really indicates that there's a period in the summer when you quite reliably get your top soils too wet for plants to get very much water out, which means that that time of year, which is also sort of the peak of the growing season, they have to utilize moisture from the bottom soils, which fortunately are still relatively wet. This leads, not surprisingly perhaps, to more transpiration from deep soils in sagebrush ecosystems than from surface soils. And this is not a common feature for dryland systems as a whole, but it certainly is a more common feature for woody-dominated systems that have deep roots. So overall, this helps us define an ecohydrological niche, as we call it, for sagebrush, that is utilization of this deep, seasonally stored water. So they really rely on that water as their primary source during the growing season. Okay. So that provides some perspective on the overall ecohydrology of sagebrush ecosystems. I'm going to have Kyle Palmquist come up and talk to you about climate change impacts on those patterns.
All right. So since soil water is such a critical factor in sagebrush ecosystems and so important for the plants and animals that are in sagebrush ecosystems, we wanted to understand how climate change in the future is going to first change soil water dynamics and soil water availability as a kind of a first step to understanding climate change impacts on sagebrush ecosystems. So this figure comes from the most recent IPCC report, and this is for the end of century for RCP 8.5, the business as usual scenario. And on the left side of the screen here are the predictions for mean annual temperature, and the sagebrush region is shaded right here in gray. And so what you can see that is that changes in mean annual temperature in the future range for sagebrush range between 4 to 5 degrees C by end of century. And estimates for precipitation in the century are much more uncertain and variable. with potential decreases of 10% and potential increases possible. And both climate and precipitation predictions for the Sagebrush region are really contingent on the climate model that's used. So we used the soil water model John just described to run simulations for 898 sagebrush sites across the range, shown here in this map. And we ran these simulations for 10 different climate models for 2 different RCPs and 3 different future time windows. And we did this to try to understand how changes in soil water dynamics would progress through mid and end of century, and to also understand how much uncertainty there might be in future projections in soil water among different climate models, so among these 10 GCMs. And so the questions we tried to address with this work were, first, how will climate change impact soil water dynamics? And this question kind of focuses on all sites across the range. So how are all these sagebrush sites going to change on average in the future? And then the next 2 questions address how those climate change impacts on ecohydrology will vary across those 898 sites. So specifically, how will climate change impacts vary across the big sagebrush ecosystem type that John described? And how will those impacts vary spatially across the range? And to do that, we used the 7 sagebrush management zones to summarize the spatial patterns. So I'm going to start by first talking about kind of the range-wide expectations for changes in soil water in the future. And I'll walk you through a series that look like this, and I'm going to take a moment here to explain this left figure. And so these, on the X for all of these upcoming figures, the X-axis are day of year. So these are daily information. And there are going to be 3 lines, and John kind of already described this, but the current conditions will be the blue line. And there are 2 solid lines that relate to the median prediction for mid-century, which is in purple, and then end of century, which is in black. And there will be 2 bands, and those represent the uncertainty across the 10 climate models we examined. One for mid-century and one for end of century. And so, and again, each of these values for each day of the year, this is an average across all of the 898 sites we examined. So it's kind of the range-wide average that we expect in the future. And on the bottom here are the annual expectations, so the annual increases or decreases for each variable. So what you can see for temperature is that all GCMs, all of the climate models predict increases in temperature, and that ranges somewhere between 3 to 6 degrees C, depending on the time window. And you can see here on the right, we're showing precipitation, changes in precipitation in the future, and there's quite a bit of variability. But you can see that, particularly in the winter months, so right here, the median lines for both future time windows tend to be above the blue line. And that suggests to us that winter precipitation, on average, is going to increase in the future on average for most of these sites. Okay, this figure is showing on the left changes in snowpack. And again, current conditions are in blue here. And you can see that all the climate models agree that snowpack will decrease in the future, and substantially so by end of century, shown here in black and the green band. And not only will snowpack decrease, but snowpack will disappear earlier. And so you can see that where the 2 solid lines, the purple and black line, dip and hit 0, and that happens earlier than under current conditions. And although the models suggest and the climate data suggests that precipitation will be increasing in the future, more of that precipitation will be falling as rain. And that's shown here in the right panel. So you can see there's a consistent decrease in the rain precipitation ratio suggesting more precipitation will be falling as rain and less will be falling as snow. And both these things we think are going to have really important implications for the amount of soil water that's stored in the summer months. And that is available for plants and big sagebrush to utilize during the growing season. This figure is showing daily transpiration for both current and future conditions, the amount of water taken up by plants. And what you can see here for both top soil layers, which are on the left, and bottom soil layers, which are on the right, is that there will be a shift in transpiration starting to occur earlier in the year. And in some cases, for some of the climate models, there will also be increases in the peak or magnitude of water uptake by plants. And this is particularly noticeable for bottom soil layers. This figure is showing soil water potential, and again for top and bottom soil layers. The way you can think about soil water potential is negative numbers tend to indicate increased dryness, so drier soils. So this is a figure that John showed briefly earlier. And again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that during the winter months, the current condition line is below the future predictions, suggesting that soils during the winter in the future will be wetter. However, because of increases in temperature, soils are going to begin to dry out more rapidly in the spring and early summer months. And you can see that here by the two median lines dropping below the current line. And soils will stay drier for much of the growing season in the future during the summer. So the onset of dry conditions will begin earlier, and that period, that dry summer period, will be extended. And that's true for both top and bottom soil layers. The last figure I want to show you for this section is groundwater recharge, so the amount of water lost out of the bottom soil layers to the ground table. And again, similar to transpiration, we see that there's a shift in the future to groundwater recharge happening earlier in the year. And also, for some of the climate models, there are big increases in groundwater recharge in the future, as suggested by the green peak here. Okay, so those are kind of the average range-wide predictions for water balance changes in the future. And so now I want to take a moment to explore how some of these same variables differ across the ecosystem types that John introduced. So the montane, higher elevation sites versus the drier, lower elevation sites. And these, all of these upcoming figures are going to focus on mid-century. And so our approach for summarizing the kind of variability among these 898 sites is by looking at changes in ecohydrology in each of the sage-grouse management zones shown here. So I'm going to show you some figures for each of the management zones and also show you some figures for the different sagebrush ecosystem types. And so this is a really neat approach to summarizing things across the region and for particular ecosystem types. And so in this figure, it may be a little hard to see, but the different symbols correspond to sites for the montane, steppe, and shrubland ecosystem types. The management zones are colored differently, and those colors will carry on in the upcoming figures. And then the pie charts here represent the proportion of ecosystem types in each management zone. So you can see, for instance, in management zone 1, there's no shrubland. Likewise, in management zone 6, in the northwest, there's no montane. Okay, so this series of box plots is actually showing change from current to future conditions for available soil water. So this is water that's available for plants to use, and this is for mid-century. And so values above 0 indicate increases in soil water in the future, while values below 0 indicate decreases. And the two panels relate to changes for the spring months in the future and changes for the summer months on the right side. And this is for topsoil layers. And so what you can see, the black line is the median, and gives a sense of, for all, the average change in soil water for shrublands. And the box and whiskers indicates the range of responses for that same ecosystem type. And so what you can see is that, similar to the last set of figures I showed you, soil water in the spring months is going to go up, but particularly so for the montane sagebrush sites that occur at higher elevations. In contrast, soil water will decrease in the summer months, and especially so, again, for the high elevation montane sites. The other variable we wanted to look at was change in the number of dry days in the future. And again, this is summarized for each ecosystem type by mid-century. And similar to changes in soil water in spring, we see really no shift in the number of dry days, indicating conditions are still going to be wet in the spring. And this is more or less consistent across the ecosystem types, although there's a bit more variability among shrublands, the drier ecosystem types, as you can see by the box plot here. In contrast, summers, again, will be drier, and more dry days are expected in the future, especially for sagebrush steppe and sagebrush montane ecosystems. Okay, and then the last question in this section of the talk is understanding how climate change impacts on soil water might emerge in the future spatially. And so again, we're going to use those sage-grouse management zones to summarize those results. I have the inset map that I described to you earlier here so you can remind yourself where each of these zones is. So this is data for, again, available soil water by mid-century. And we're showing changes here again. So increases are above 0 and decreases are below 0. And so what you can see for spring will actually be quite wetter, especially for management zones 1 through 4. So kind of the north and eastern part of the sagebrush regions. And summer conditions, during the summer, soil water is going to decline, and that's kind of consistent across all of the management zones, but especially for management zones 4 and 5, which are in the central and western central portion of the range. And finally, this figure is showing change in the number of dry days by management zone. And again, this suggests in the spring, conditions will still be relatively wet in the future. And interestingly, for management zones 1 and 2, we actually see a decrease in the number of spring dry days, which means conditions are going to be quite a bit wetter. And the right-hand figure is for summer, and we see pretty consistent increases in the number of dry days across management zones, but particularly for management zones 1, 2, and 6, and 4. So kind of the northern portion of the sagebrush region. Okay, so to summarize what I've just told you, temperatures will be warmer in the future, and we're expecting kind of range-wide increases in winter precipitation on average. Warmer temperatures are going to result in reduced snowpack and disappearance of snow earlier in the year. And also, despite the fact that there will be more winter precipitation, more of that precipitation will be falling as rain. And shifts in temperature are going to shift transpiration and groundwater recharge to earlier in the year. Our soil water potential results suggest wetter winters and an extended dry summer period when plants are growing. I didn't comment much on this, but the ecohydrological responses we saw did vary a bit across GCMs, and you could see that in the width of those colored bands. And I also wanted to mention here that the uncertainty in these predictions increases towards the end of the century because there's more uncertainty in the climate models at that time period. And these changes, climate change impacts on ecohydrology, will vary both geographically and ecologically. And so despite the fact that most management zones and ecosystem types are expected to have drier conditions in the summer months, we actually think that this is going to result in kind of two different outcomes across the sagebrush region. So drier conditions in the southwest region are going to make those systems just that much drier and continue to make them more vulnerable to invasion and fire. However, slightly drier conditions and warmer temperatures in the higher elevation sites and in the northern latitudes actually may increase habitat suitability for sagebrush and sagebrush-dependent species in the future. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to John, and he's going to talk about sagebrush suitability and regeneration.
Thanks. So Kyle just told you about what our modeling approach has to say about a lot of the basic metrics of ecohydrology and how they're likely to respond to climate change. But of course, what we really want to do with that is start trying to say, what does that mean for sagebrush ecosystems and sagebrush plant communities? And so we're going to shift into that kind of perspective for the rest of the topics today. And the first one is relatively straightforward. So what do these changes suggest about the suitability of all sites to actually support sagebrush ecosystems, and also about the ability to support sagebrush regeneration? So just taking the first of those, the overall suitability of a location to support sagebrush ecosystems, we approach this through the perspective of species distribution modeling, which hopefully many of you are familiar with. It's basically the idea of using a set of predictor variables and information about where species exists and where it doesn't exist currently, and relating those two pieces of information to identify which variables have influence, or at least are related to where it exists, and develop models that predict what are the conditions that actually support a given species or ecosystem type. So to do this, we use GAT data, shown here on the left, as our metric as well as agrarian records of where sagebrush exists. And we did two types of species distribution models. We did the first, just climate-driven, the climate SDM, the panel shown there in the middle. We also built species distribution models based on soil water metrics only, on soil water availability metrics, and that's shown on the right. So in many cases, these are relatively similar. This shows the current forecast of suitability in red areas, whereas you have low suitability in green areas. You see it does a pretty good job of highlighting most of the places that sagebrush exists. We're also able to, once you build one of these models, you can take it and use future climate as drivers and see where suitability is likely to be in the future and how that compares with current conditions. And that we've done for both of these models. It's a little bit hard to tell how much that changed. So we have a plot here that shows you the change between current and future. The red areas are places where the models forecast declining suitability to support sagebrush ecosystems. Gray areas are relatively stable, and blue areas are areas of increasing suitability. And again, the climate SDM is on the left, and the soil water SDM is on the right. There's just a few main take-home points to get from this. First, at a regional scale, both approaches have quite similar results, and in fact quite similar overall metrics of accuracy and total percent change. They forecast declines along the southern tier in that red area, as well as declines in low elevation places throughout the region, although that's a little bit harder to see. They also both forecast increasing suitability, especially in the north and eastern part of the region, shown by the blue arrow there. However, there's some differences that I think important to note. They both have similar regional patterns, as I said, but if you zoom in on any one location, they do have different forecasts for a given place, and the soil water model in general is more heterogeneous at small spatial scales because it's able to respond to variability in soils, whereas the climate one, by definition, is only responding to climate SDMs. And so this illustrates, I think, that there's some value in trying to approach these questions, not just from climate, but also from moisture. And so if you wanted to talk about and think about managing and make decisions about a given site on the ground, you might have a little more confidence in the model that includes some information about your soil conditions. So this is, I'll return to where we're heading with suitability in a moment, but first I want to talk a little bit about what we've done with sagebrush regeneration. So in just about all water-limited dry systems, especially for woody plants, regeneration is a major challenge. It's typically something that doesn't happen very often. It requires unusual conditions to allow the plant species to germinate and survive. And so we wanted to explore what are the conditions that control regeneration in sagebrush ecosystems, and what does the future hold for that? So the first thing we did was a literature review, just asking what do we know, we being the proverbial we, in terms of the literature about sagebrush regeneration. And we found a few things. First of all, it is quite episodic, which just alludes to what I just mentioned, that it doesn't happen all the time. In fact, most of the time, conditions are not suitable for sagebrush regeneration. Seed availability, at least for intact stands of sagebrush, is seldom limiting because these plants can produce a lot of seed. And there are some important environmental controls that influence regeneration that are probably vulnerable to climate change. Those include the available soil moisture. So if it gets too dry in the soils, it'll kill the young sagebrush germinant. Also temperature, if it gets too cold at the wrong time of year, and snowpack. If you have a season that's especially short because of long snowpack, that can be detrimental to regeneration success. So with this information, we then built a model that uses our output from the soil water model and asks the questions of when do we observe conditions that would support regeneration. So this kind of a schematic of how that works. We've got our soil water model over here. For that, we estimate for every day the soil water potential for each layer, as well as the temperature and the snowpack. We then use that to ask in a germination module, would that year at that location have supported germination? Would it have had the conditions it needs for sagebrush to germinate, which is really metrics of water availability in the top soil layer when it's warm enough and snow-free for them to do so. And then we can ask subsequently, if it were to have germinated, would there have been conditions that would have allowed that seedling to survive to the end of the first year? Which is, I mean, can it get through that dry period that we talked about earlier in the talk, in which the summer soil moisture at the surface is really quite dry. So this survival to the end of the first year is a big question. So we use this model to ask questions about the frequency of observing conditions that support germination or survival across a set of sites. We also first just ran it for current conditions, and so that's what I'm showing here. Just the left is a reminder of where sagebrush exists. The middle panel is under historical conditions, what's the probability of observing conditions that support sagebrush germination. You can see high probabilities are shown in green, low in red. Most of the area has conditions that would support sagebrush germination most years. This is perhaps not surprising if you think back to the overall ecohydrology of these sites, where you have winter recharge of soil moisture both at the surface and deep. So there is a period of time in the early spring or maybe early summer when you have wet enough surface soil moisture that you can allow seeds to germinate. Kind of makes sense. And then the probability of establishment is shown on the right, and these are much lower probabilities and much more spatially heterogeneous. So this really illustrates that while most places allow germination, survival to the end of the first year is not quite so clear-cut. It's important to note that these germination and establishment are obviously not the only controls over the distribution of sagebrush. There's all kinds of other things like competition with other plants. And so we map these variables very widely, but really it's the probabilities within the distribution of sagebrush that suggest that germination is not limiting, but establishment probably is. All right, so then the first thing, and to date the main thing we've done with this model is to say, okay, let's just run this establishment model at some trailing edge sites. By that I mean these red areas down here where we're expected to have declines in suitability. We call that the trailing edge. And some leading edge sites, these sites up here in blue, that are expected to be where sagebrush is leading toward in the future, and ask, do the potential future probability of regeneration, is that consistent with what we observe in terms of the overall ecohydrological suitability? And this is a bit complicated, these figures, but I'll walk you through it. The left side is just results for the trailing edge, the two panels. The right side is the results for the leading edge. The top is the probability of observing conditions that support germination. The bottom is the probability of conditions that support survival to the end of the first year. The different bars are different climate models, with the dark bar being the current conditions for each one, and then this line drawn across is the average of current conditions to provide you with a metric to compare all these different future climate models to the current conditions. So what does this suggest? Let's start with the trailing edge. For all of the climate models, our results suggest that the future is going to have less likely occurrence of conditions that support germination in the future. So something that was not limiting in the past on those trailing edge southern sites may become more limiting in the future as we get fewer and fewer years that would even support germination, which has been pretty much a given in the past. In terms of survival, You see most of the models do suggest, again, decreases in the probability of surviving to the end of the first year in this trailing edge location, so most of those are below the line. In the leading edge, all the models, current and future, suggest germination still is not a problem. And actually, we see increases in the probability of observing conditions that would support survival to the first year in this leading edge. So these places are actually getting more similar to places that are currently occupied by sagebrush. So the bottom line from this is that these metrics of more episodic climate conditions that control this one process, which is regeneration, those results are quite consistent with the overall long-term metrics we were looking at for overall suitability. So we have places that we showed in red, the trailing edge, where we're going to have declining suitability. We also have declining probabilities of observing the conditions that allow regeneration. By contrast, the leading edge, we have increasing overall mean suitability as well as increasing probability of regeneration. Okay, so what we've talked about so far up to now have been a bunch of studies that are either published. Most of them are published. One of them is still in review, but most of them have been published. We're going to kind of shift to things that we're actively involved in, and then end with some ideas that we'd like to do in the future. And so the first thing that we're still working on right now that I hope to have, well, we hope in the next several months to be finishing up, is some updated regeneration and suitability analyses. So if you notice that the regeneration, for example, we just did at the trailing edge and leading edge, we're going to do that range-wide at a 10-kilometer grid so that we get a better sort of spatially contiguous representation of that. We're also going to update our suitability analysis to the latest climate forecasts across that same grid. We're going to do this for different time periods, whereas in the past we've just done the end of the 21st century. We're going to do current, mid-century, and the end of the century to provide a little bit more near-term metrics about what the future holds. We're also working to quantify the soil temperature and soil moisture regimes, the NRCS definition of soil temperature and moisture regimes that provide some of the foundational input to the resistance and resilience matrix that's becoming widely used in sagebrush ecosystems. So this is what's coming next in the next several months for the regeneration and suitability analysis. Okay, our next topic is plant species biodiversity, and Bill's going to tell you about that.
Okay, John indicated that most of the topics we've been talking about have been really soil water model focused, and if you look at what's coming in the future here, we've got some activities that are more focused on plant communities, and we have a plant community model that we use in conjunction with our soil water model. And as part of beginning that process, we set out to sample sagebrush plant communities, sagebrush ecosystems across the range to be able to estimate parameters for the model. And I'm going to talk about two aspects of that as we get a little further into this topic. One of the things we discovered as we began thinking about plant communities and how we're going to represent them in our models is that sage-grouse biologists, greater sage-grouse biologists, seem to think that forbs are really important to sage-grouse. As plant ecologists, we know that the forbs are really probably the most poorly represented part of our understanding of almost all ecosystems and plant communities. And we were sort of interested in finding out, so if these things are so important, what do we currently know about this? And again, this is the big we in science. So what do plant ecologists and sage-grouse biologists really know about these forbs that seem to be important to the grouse? And then what are the key characteristics of these sagebrush plant communities that we should represent in our models? So I want to talk to you about both of those aspects. One is sort of the big plant community structure part of sagebrush, and this sort of unknown piece about the role that forbs play in that. So what we know about big sagebrush plant communities is they have an overstory of woody plants. The majority of this overstory is represented by big sagebrush. There are some other shrubs that occur in there. and then an understory of grasses and forbs. And if it's not clear to you what we mean by forbs, it's a really difficult sort of a fuzzy concept. So I'm going to tell you what forbs are by telling you what they're not. And forbs are herbs that are not grasses, they're not sedges, and they're not rushes. Everything else, we've got lots of other names for them, but that'll probably be suitable for now. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple activities. One, this what do we currently know about forbs in sagebrush plant communities, and then what did we find out when we set out to sample these communities to collect data to estimate parameters for our model. So we set out to assess the state of the knowledge about forbs in sagebrush plant communities and sage-grouse habitat, and we took the usual approach to that of a literature review, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the characteristics of that. In our sampling of sagebrush across the range, we sort of came to this came out of the literature review in terms of why don't we know more, and I want to talk about that in terms of contrasting the elements of these plant communities that provide the major structure for the plant communities and the elements that provide species richness, and then finally focusing in particularly on forbs as a key component of species richness. Okay, so I said we asked the question, and here when I say we, I'm talking about the work of a master's student at the University of Wyoming, Victoria Penny. So what Victoria did was just dig into the literature. What are all the kinds of documents that we might expect to have some information about sage-grouse habitat and sage-grouse plant communities and the role of forbs. So these are the kinds of documents that Victoria looked at. When it was all done, we found 68 documents that met our criteria and that we thought were relevant. And here's how they sort of fell into various categories. So part of them were diet studies for greater sage-grouse. These are crop content kinds of studies, and these are studies that mention the frequency of forbs found in sage-grouse crops. 23 of them were habitat studies, and this is just looking at sort of what does sage-grouse habitat look like and what are the various components of it. About the same number came from the range management literature, and if for those of you that have sort of looked at the history of sagebrush for a very long time, the key objective of range managers was to get rid of it so that these locations could grow more grass or grow more forbs for livestock. So there's a fair amount of mentioning of forbs in that literature, and then finally there's some studies that looked at sagebrush plant communities with respect to climate, and again, forbs were mentioned. But here's sort of the big picture. While forbs were commonly mentioned in a lot of these documents, the kind of information and the amount of detail that was included there was extremely limited. Most of the information, and for those of you that have been out in the field, you're going to understand this, and I'll explain a little more as we go, but most of this information was not species specific. It was about forbs as a group, and there's a number of reasons for that. And important among them is that for most plant community ecologists, when you set out to go sample a plant community, the focus is on the major parts of the structure of the community. That is, the dominants and a few of the subdominant species. And then there's a whole bunch of things that we call rare species that we tend to tell ourselves, well, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough something to really focus on that part of it. So while there were some some documents out there that describe Forbs. They're extremely limited, and very few of them mention specific species that seem to be important to sagebrush. So this information that we compiled is now in a paper that's been submitted to the Western North American Naturalists. We're revising. We hope that that you'll be able to read that in the near future if you want to see what the current state of the knowledge about Forbs in sagebrush plant communities and sagebrush habitat is. Okay, so we set out to do some sampling of sagebrush and sage-grouse habitat as a way to estimate parameters for our plant community model. The red dot. So here's the map of sagebrush in the light gray, and the outline of the sage-grouse management zones, and the red dots are the sites that we sampled. And we tried to distribute them throughout management zones. We didn't hit all of them, and we didn't cover any of them in very much detail, but we were successful in locating sites in most of these, most of the management. So, okay. So, as a result of our literature review, and finally figuring out that one of the reasons why we don't have better information about Forbs is the way we sampled for Forbs. So we decided to take a two-pronged attack. This is the traditional. This is what almost everybody who has sampled sagebrush plant communities has done. A few plots, small quadrats, a small number of quadrats that really don't cover very much of the surface area of the plant community. So if you think, so at each site we sampled 3 10 by 10 meter plots. We counted and measured all the shrubs, and then for the understory, we located 30 20 by 50 centimeter quadrats in each of these 10 by 10s. So we got 100 square meters. We're sampling 3 square meters of it for the understory. That gets us a reasonable estimate of the grasses. Counting all the shrubs in a 10 by 10 gets us a pretty reasonable estimate of the shrubs. Of big sagebrush is important, and a pretty lousy estimate of which Forbs are there and how important they are. So because we had a specific interest in Forbs, we also used a different method. So at each one of these sites, and alongside these 10 by 10 meter plots, we located 3 100 meter long by 2.4 meter wide belt transects. And we went through those transects and just identified every Forb we came to. So here we're measuring 240 square meters compared to our 3 square meters in each one of these 10 by 10 plots. Okay, so what do we find? All right. One of the things, and again, if you've been out in sagebrush country, you probably know this. This figure is on the y-axis. We've got cover of bare ground and litter, and on the x-axis, all of the sites that we sampled. And the thing to notice here is that for these plant communities, this is a common characteristic of dryland plant communities. A lot of the surface is covered by things other than plants. And in this case, 50 to 70% of the surface area of these sites is covered by bare ground and litter. So it's the major element of the structure of these sites. Okay, so then we ask the question, so of the rest of the cover, of the plant cover, how is that plant cover distributed among major plant groups? And not too surprisingly, except maybe for, is this working? Yeah. For these are Great Plains sites here. These are, this is Management Zone 1, Montana. For most of the sites, shrubs are the major component of the vegetation. Not as clear for the Great Plains portion of these sites, but for the most part. And then grasses. Where am I? Grasses are the second most important component of the vegetation. And finally, down here at the bottom is the forb component. And you can see again the Great Plains sites are a little bit different than many of the other sagebrush sites, but forbs make up 5 to 30% of the plant cover of these sites, much less of the total cover. So in terms of the structure, they're relatively unimportant, but in terms of the number of species, even though they account for a very small amount of the cover, they account for 60% of the species richness of these systems. Grasses are about a quarter of the species richness, and the shrubs, as I said, there's a few of them, but doesn't really account for much in terms of the number of species. Okay, so let's look a little bit at our transect results. So now what we've got are forb species richness on the y-axis. This is just the number of forb species we found, and then on the x-axis, the area that we sampled to find this. And you can see this is managed zone 1. This is sites in the state of Montana. So these are Great Plains kinds of sites that the more area we sampled, the more forbs we found. And that was true even though there are differences among our 3 sites in terms of how many forbs that we found. It was true for all of them that as we increased the area we looked at, we increased the number of species we found. And if we look at other management zones, here's management zone 2. These are sites in Wyoming and Colorado. Same thing. And even at this site where we didn't find very many forbs, the number of forbs we found kept increasing essentially all the way to the end of our transect. At the end, we were still finding additional species. And it's true managed zone 3 and managed zones 4 and 5 combined. So the picture here is there's quite a bit of variability among sites. For instance, this site. Do I get to go back? Yeah. This site in Idaho. If I can find it. Jackpot had very few forbs, and additional sites in that management zones had a larger number of forbs. Anyway, so the more area you sample, the more forbs you find, and that's one of the explanations for why the representation of forbs in the literature is not better. Here's another problem with forbs. So now on the y-axis we've got the number of sites. This is the number of sites we found a particular forb species at, and along the x-axis are just a bar for every one of the 136 different forb species we found. First thing to notice about this is that most of the forbs we found them at only one site. And this is a key problem. If you got to do forbs, you have got to know a lot of plants, or you've got to spend a lot of time in the herbarium identifying plants. We didn't find a single forb species that occurred at every site. And there was one species, Phlox hoodii, that occurred at 12 of our sites. So it was the most common species we found. So when you go out to sample forbs, you go to different sites, you find different collections of plants, and it is just a very large task to deal with those. Okay, so what do we know about forbs in sagebrush ecosystems? They get mentioned in almost every publication by grouse biologists in terms of habitat, but there's very little information about what that means. Vegetation ecologists have done a terrible job of sampling them because it's just really difficult to do so. They're not a very important component of the vegetation structure. That is, they don't really contribute much to cover. They don't contribute much to biomass, but they are the major component of plant species richness. And then finally, I didn't show you any of these results, but our analyses indicate precipitation and soil texture are sort of the key drivers of forb composition across these sites that we take as sort of reinforcement of our work focused on ecohydrology. So what are we going to do in the future? What's our next step? So we have a project with the Wyoming Biodiversity Institute that is going to allow us to sample the state of Wyoming a little bit more intensively than we were able to sample the entire sagebrush region. We have hopes to be able to do this across the entire region eventually, but we're going to start with Wyoming in the summer of 2016. What I'm showing you here is a figure that represents the number of our 898 sites that occurred in Wyoming. We're going to sample, we hope to sample up to 50 of those during this summer, and our focus is going to be on trying to represent the major gradients in driving variables that represent variability among sites in terms of plant community structure and numbers of forbs. Okay, that I'm going to turn it back to Kyle, and she'll talk to you about our plant community model.
Yeah, so this portion of the talk is still in progress as I'm running a bunch of different simulations, but this portion of our work tries to understand more directly the climate change impacts on big sagebrush plant communities by using the parameters that we collected in those 15 field sites that Bill just described, and a coupled modeling approach, which I'll tell you about in a second. So our three questions were, how will the big sagebrush plant community respond to changes in climate in the future? Will the core sage-grouse habitat continue to be high quality in the future? And how are changing disturbance regimes, fire, differences in the intensity of grazing going to interact with climate to influence plant community patterns in the future? So to do this, we are using what we call STEPWAT, and this is a coupled simulation modeling approach that links SOILWAT, which you've already heard a lot about, and STEP, which is an individual-based annual plant model where plants establish, grow, and die. And so to walk you through the model and remind you, the inputs to SOILWAT are weather, and that can either be current or future weather, soil properties for multiple soil layers, and some vegetation parameters, including biomass. And the key variable we track in our coupled STEPWAT modeling approach is soil water availability for plants to use. And so each year, SOILWAT runs, and soil water availability is determined. That is then brought over to the plant model and serves as resource availability for plants to grow. So based on that resource availability that year, water, plants establish, grow, and then die. And then at the end of the year, the vegetation parameters are brought back into SOILWAT and used as input to run the next year of the water simulation model. So in this way, it's a linked couple model where there's exchange of information between the two components. And the great thing about this model is it allows us to understand how future climate and future weather is going to influence water and how that's going to influence growth and survival of big sagebrush plants. And also within this framework, we have the capacity to manipulate disturbance directly by manipulating fire frequency and also by manipulating the intensity of grazing. So we can look at the interactions between changes in climate and disturbance over a variety of sites. And so that's kind of our long-term goal. And so what I'm going to show you initially here are just some very initial results from some of the simulations we've run, and we hope to build on this over the next month or two. So to summarize what we've done so far and what we hope to do when we complete these simulation runs is we're manipulating fire frequency and using fire every 2, 10, and 50 years. We're also manipulating grazing. Grazing in the model happens on an annual basis, but we're manipulating the amount of biomass removed to kind of mimic low, moderate, and high grazing intensities. And then we're running these simulations for 4 different broad soil types on which big sagebrush ecosystems occur. And again, we're doing this for different climate models, focusing on RCP 8.5 and then 2 future time windows and also current conditions to understand both how the vegetation might respond mid-century, which will perhaps be more immediately useful for managers, and how it will respond end of century. And so today I'm just going to summarize results that we have for 5 sites from Management Zone 2, so, which includes much of Wyoming. And these 5 sites were chosen to span the really the climatic gradients that occur in the management zone. So sites that are found in the hot, dry end to the cooler, moist end at higher elevation. So it kind of represents the climate space. And so these initial figures will give you a sense of the types of results we can generate with this model. And so this figure is showing change in plant biomass on the Y. And each of these bars is a different functional group that's in our model. So annual cool season forbs and grasses, annual warm season forbs, perennial cool season forbs and grasses, and perennial warm season forbs and grasses, and then of course sagebrush. And so what this figure represents is the change in biomass between current and future conditions. And what you can see is that for some resource groups, our initial simulation suggests there may be relatively small changes in biomass. And for sagebrush in particular, we see a larger range of responses. And I should also note that the variability you're seeing here is changes in biomass across different climate models. So you'll note that for sagebrush, for the state of Wyoming, these 5 sites suggest that biomass for sagebrush will increase in the future. However, there are a few sites, well, there are a few GCMs, rather, that suggest decreases. And the other group where there are larger increases in biomass are annual cool season grasses. However, I do want to note and draw your attention to the scale of the Y here, and that we're talking about changes of around 5 to 10 grams of biomass, which is, especially for sagebrush, a relatively small fraction of the total biomass out there. And so these very initial results suggest perhaps little change in biomass for big sagebrush communities in the state of Wyoming. But we hope to run more simulations to more directly address that question. And this is the same figure for end of century. So the things you'll notice that differ from the last figure is that the median change in sagebrush biomass is a bit lower, and there's greater variability in changes in biomass across those different climate models. And that's reflecting the fact that we have less certainty in climate predictions at the end of the century. And so another example of things we can do with this model is then relate changes in biomass back to ecohydrological variables we care about or climatic variables we care about. And so this figure is showing you results for each of those 5 sites. And on the X is change in mean annual precipitation in the future for those sites, and then on the Y is change in biomass. So for the 2 groups in the last set of figures that had the biggest range of responses in biomass, I wanted to show how how changes in biomass might relate to climatic variables. So what you can see here is that sites that are expected to have increases in precipitation in the future also tend to have increases in biomass. So this is suggesting that within a management zone, sites may not respond in the same way. And so we can use the ecohydrological variables that are tracked in the soil part of the model and try to link them back to the vegetation parameters we care about. And finally, I wanted to show you just a couple figures that examine how fire frequency and how often fire occurs is going to interact with climate to impact plant biomass. And these, again, are for mid-century. So what this figure is showing, again, on the Y is biomass in grams per meter squared. And so we ran these simulations for 200 years. And for the first 100 years, we allowed essentially the plants to establish and grow and reach more or less steady state. And then at year 100, we began to implement disturbances. And so what you can see is that at year 100, we have a mortality event, a fire happened, and then we have recovery of plants thereafter. And this top panel is a fire frequency of 50 years. So you can see that if fire continues to occur every 50 years, it takes a little bit of time for sagebrush to recover, but it eventually reaches at least 100 grams in our model. And the community continues to be dominated by sagebrush. In contrast, if we use the same simulation approach but implement fire at an interval of every 2 years, we see a shift from a sagebrush-dominated plant community to one that's dominated by grasses, including annual cool season grasses and perennial cool season grasses. So this gives you a sense of how we can manipulate disturbance within our modeling framework and say something about the interacting effects of climate change and disturbance. Okay, so the next steps for this work are to run these same simulations, allowing fire frequency and grazing to vary, and running simulations for multiple soil types. And we're going to do this for 66 sites across the entire sagebrush region. And so we've selected 51 of those 898 sites we've run SOILWAT simulations for. And we're also going to run simulations for the 15 field sites Bill just described. And we've chosen these sites to span the full geographic extent of sagebrush ecosystems and to also capture the relevant climatic gradients. So these two maps are showing you the geographic locations of those 66 sites. And it may be hard to see, but the field sites are in our blue triangles here, and the 51 sites are the black circles. And essentially you can see that they span a range of mean annual temperature conditions and mean annual precipitation. So we're trying to capture sites that represent, again, the hot, dry end of the environmental gradient and the cool, moist end. And so this work is in progress, and we hope to complete these simulations within a month's time. Okay, so then I'm going to turn it back to John to talk about mortality.
Last topic. We're almost done. Good patience, everyone. So this last topic is, we're shifting even from in progress to just getting started. We just spent a couple weeks out looking at some mortality sites, a couple weeks ago looking at sites. So sagebrush mortality, this is, mortality of this dominant species in these ecosystems is a mechanism by which these systems can convert from being the sagebrush communities that we know them as to something else in the future. So understanding the controls over that is really important for being able to project how and when and where these systems might start to become something else. And we've been thinking about this for a little while, and I've observed some what looks to me like mortality down here in the trailing edge we've talked about before, these red areas with declining suitability. This is a picture from northern New Mexico. And I thought, oh gosh, maybe those are harbingers of change. And then more recently, there's been a mortality event much more in the core of sage grouse and sagebrush habitat right here in southwest Wyoming. And this is a picture we took a couple weeks ago. Pretty wide areas of sagebrush mortality, and this really prompted some concerns that we need to understand this process if we're going to be able to project the future. In fact, there was a report generated by Klaus and Randall in 2014, I think, that described patterns of this. And so this is a map of Wyoming, and they show there's a bunch of sites here just west of Sparson where they observed mortality. And they speculated about what may be causing this. They noted a couple of patterns that are worth noting. In 2012, there's a pretty extreme drought throughout the year in these sites. And then in late 2013, in the fall, there was some really heavy precipitation events that caused some flooding. And so there's two potentially somewhat contrasting events that occurred that may be driving mortality. So we went out and took a look at this, and we wrote a proposal to the USGS and the support of Steve and Greg, got some funding to do a project to try to understand what's driving this mortality that's been observed in southwest Wyoming. We went out and started looking for sites a couple weeks ago. This is the map, just to zoom in from the Klaus and Randall report. You can kind of see there's a bullseye. Meeting with Jill, she really described it as a bullseye, kind of denoted by these red arrows. And within that area, in the center of the range, walk around and look at it. It looks like there's mortality that kind of looks like this, dead sagebrush, that occurs on all topographic positions. It occurs at the bottoms of drainages or even relatively low areas, and also up on the tops of drainages. So in this core area, there's mortality kind of everywhere. But out on the periphery, which is kind of denoted by some of these blue or these green dots around the edge, there's still sagebrush mortality, although it's perhaps not 100%. You can see this picture shows some mortality, but also some still live sagebrush. And it appears to be much more isolated in that periphery to low topographic positions, kind of in the drainage bottoms. In fact, you can go quite a bit further out beyond here and still see it in the very pronounced drainage bottom. So it suggests there may be a couple of mechanisms that are driving. It could be that there's ponded water in these drainage bottoms, perhaps in conjunction with high salt contents that are killing the sagebrush. They're known to be not tolerant to anoxic soil conditions. And so, yeah, so the higher positions probably are not this ponded water, because it's hard to imagine how you get saturated soils and ponded water in clearly upland positions that have easy drainage paths. By contrast, you can see this picture shows a bunch of dead sagebrush down here in this drainage bottom, and this may be a different mechanism. So we have this occurrence of a drought and a heavy flooding that may be creating mortality for two different reasons. So we're just trying to tease that apart. We have some hypotheses, but more to come about what we find with this. So our overall goals are to characterize the moisture conditions that caused this recent mortality. So we're going to sample soils, we're going to reconstruct what the soil moisture conditions were like in 2012 and 2013 and 2014, and try to understand what occurred in these sites and why these sagebrush plants died both in the lowlands and the uplands. And then also, once we get a feel for what that is, what drives mortality, we can look historically and into the future about the likelihood of observing those kind of events. Similar to what we did with regeneration before, we can say, well, do these kind of events in uplands, do they happen once every 20 years or once every 50 years? And is that going to be changing to once every 5 years in the future? We can start to get a feel for what the future holds for that. So, as I said, we're going to be starting our sampling this summer. We're going to include upland and lowland areas, both inside and outside of the core areas, and we're going to try to relate mortality to soil moisture conditions. We're thinking a little bit about how even this patchy sort of mortality may be important when we think about what these systems provide. As I mentioned, mortality can be a potential pathway for conversion of the system to something else. And one thing we noticed in driving around is the SOILWAT in the upland patches of mortality in the core areas is really widely distributed, far away from the road. And talking to Jill Randall, before the mortality was really restricted to the roadsides. So maybe this mortality is providing a potential opportunity for the proliferation and spread of these invasive species. The other thing that's worth noting is that this site where this mortality is occurring is really close to the Jonah oil field up there. And so you've got these two different types of disturbance going on, both of which may be increasing the fragmentation of the landscape. And so it's important to note that even the mortality that causes small patches may be important when you superimpose it or juxtapose it with this kind of pervasive of energy development. And this is another perspective on the Jonah oil field. It's pretty remarkable. So this picture we took, but this picture we didn't take. Although if we have money, we'd love to get up there and have a look at it. One thing to note about this energy development is This is a picture we found of one that's relatively recently rehabilitated, and this is one 26 years later, and they still, the plant communities on, I mean, this one obviously has no plant community to speak of yet. This one's had 26 years, and there are plants there. You can still see the rows of grasses that they planted, and importantly, there's almost no sagebrush on these old well pads. So questions about how long does it take to recover from this, how long might it take to recover from those mortality events, I think are worthwhile questions to try to understand in the context of understanding climate change impacts. Okay, so we've covered perhaps too much, a lot. I just wanted to quickly summarize to you some of the key take-home messages from these different topics. First, with respect to the ecohydrology of sagebrush, we've characterized this ecohydrological niche in which sagebrush really relies upon utilization of this deep stored moisture that occurs during the cool season. In terms of climate change impacts on ecohydrology, we're likely to have wetter winters, and small increases perhaps in winter precipitation, but more importantly, substantial increases in soil moisture in the winter because some of that's going to be becoming as wet as rain instead of snow. It's going to get into the soil. But that's going to be combined with longer and hotter and drier summer conditions, which leads to the question, so what is, are the sagebrush individuals and the communities going to be able to survive that long, hot summer? In terms of suitability and regeneration, our work suggested that we're expecting some declines in the southern part of the range and in low elevation areas. This may lead to a potential rain shift in coming decades. Certainly, we expect a shift in the areas that would support sagebrush. The dynamics of how sagebrush responds to that are still uncertain. In terms of plant species biodiversity, a lot of evidence that forbs are a key habitat component, but we really don't know very much about it. So Bill talked about what we're working to do to try to fill that knowledge gap. In terms of plant community responses, this is still in progress, but we do have some evidence, and we expect that climate and disturbances are likely to interact, and the influence of both climate change and disturbances we think will vary substantially across the range, both north to south with temperature gradient and probably east to west. There's probably some differences between how places in Wyoming might respond to places in Idaho, for example. And then we're starting on a mortality project. We think there's probably some long-term landscape scale consequences of this mortality, and it's probably responding to multiple different mechanisms. So we have some ideas about knowledge gaps, but maybe I'll be quick. Okay. Well, we're almost done. This is the last slide. So just a few thoughts about, from our perspective, what are the remaining things, and there are many, that we think are really important. We're just focusing on understanding mortality in southwest Wyoming, so it obviously has patterns beyond that. We haven't tried to understand, and few people have, the potential for sagebrush to actually move into new areas, like the leading edge. I mean, how does that happen? It's going to relate to both seed banks and dispersal potential, so there's a lot of uncertainty there. We think it'd be useful. I mean, we're simulating a lot of disturbances and climate change impacts. It'd be nice to try to get some field data to sort of validate some of those recovery patterns on well pads and fires. I think it's going to be very useful. And following mortality. For example, if we could follow these mortality events we're mapping now or find older ones and see how it's recovered. It's probably reasonable to believe that there's just some important and relatively poorly understood geographic patterns of vulnerability to annual grass invasion. So the cheatgrass fire cycle that's going on in the Great Basin has not really happened in parts of Wyoming. Why is that? And is the future going to shift them to shift the eastern parts to be more like the stuff in the west that's really vulnerable to that? I think we could explore that. Most of our analyses relate to looking at long-term mean conditions, and that's partly because that's what we use a lot, but it's also partly because I'm not sure that the climate models do a good job of representing extreme events. But we might want to do some analysis where we impose some extreme events and try to ask what the system would do, because they may be increasing in the future, and they could have a big influence that's relatively poorly understood. We're also trying to, and we're interested in trying to develop forecasts of a lot of these processes over much more short time scales. Rather than talking about the middle of the 21st century, can we talk about 2020 to 2030? And I think in some cases we probably can, in some we can't. We're also interested in thinking about the high-quality habitat areas for species other than just greater sage-grouse. Maybe Gunnison sage-grouse, and habitat is down here, a lot of red down there. So it might be worth focusing some efforts on that. Okay. Thank you for sticking with us. It's been a long haul.
We do have time for questions. And we've got about 110 people on the web, so there's been a lot of questions coming in to Matt. So I want to start here and see if there are any questions here in the room, and then if we do have them, for if you guys would just repeat the question so the folks on the phone could hear, and then I'll shift to you, Matt, and you can start reading some of the questions you've gotten through the chat. Drew?
I have a question with the, thanks for mentioning the page draft. Looking at the map, it seemed like, maybe because I was squinting after I was last day, it seemed like for germination and establishment, it was actually positive areas were pretty good. Yeah, in some of those areas, but then longer term, still saying looking at good in terms of maintaining huge pressure over the long term.
Well, I'd have to look back at those maps. Certainly, the higher elevation areas, even in the south, can have positive forecasts for regeneration and suitability. I'd have to look back at the maps and think again about the kind of situation.
Yeah, specifically some of the areas I'm looking at, I think it was probably Duck Creek, kind of high water, far away. Yeah. Maybe it is at a little higher elevation.
Yeah, and that's certainly something we found, is that there's a strong relationship both with latitude that's easy to see on the regional map. Right. There's also a strong relationship with elevation that doesn't come out in the regional map quite as well. So yeah, we can talk more about it and look at what the forecast suggests.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, Matt.
Yeah, the first one is from Joseph Dabibi, and his question is, what soil depth in units of measure corresponds to the soil water potential? And this is reference to John's first portion.
The units for our soil water potential are in negative megapascals, and the depth we have, I don't know which figure you were specifically thinking about, but we often break the soils into sort of what we think of as a top soil layer and a bottom soil layer. We usually think about the top 30 centimeters, and then the soil deeper than that. We usually simulate down to, we have to use gridded soils data for most of our simulations, and so we end up relying on StatsGo often, and that goes down to typically 1.5 meters unless they project it to be more shallow than that, in which case we only simulate down to what they project. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. Yeah, and Joseph, if you need more clarification, you can enter your question in the question box. So the second question is regarding to Kyle's first portion. Does this, and this is again by Joseph Dabibi, does the soil water potential change as the surface soil freezes?
So we do have our model does represent soil temperature. We didn't talk about that much, I think, today. And we have recently incorporated the process in which if the soil freezes, it will halt water movement throughout the soil, but it doesn't change the water content. Now, if you have a sensor out there in frozen soil, it will read low soil water because it's in a frozen state. But our model keeps track. We talk about when we look at the impacts of the ecohydrology, we cast them in the soil water potential, but what the model actually keeps track of is water content. And so it keeps track of how much water is moving through the profile. And of course, if it freezes, it doesn't decrease that, it just doesn't let it go anywhere. So I think that answers the question.
Okay, next up is Rick Soja. What are your definitions, calendar dates for spring and summer? And this is for Kyle's first presentation.
So the question is, what are the calendar dates for spring and summer for some of the figures that Kyle showed?
Yeah, so
Correct.
Spring was March, April, May. Summer is June, July, August. So we use the traditional seasonal breakdowns based on the calendar year.
Okay. Now we're getting into John's second portion. Scott Davis has a question. What was slope aspect considered?
So this is for the simulations of the SDM work, I think. And those are big grids. So each grid in that the regional SDM is a 10-kilometer grid, and so we don't try to represent the topographic heterogeneity within that. We are doing simulations to represent soil heterogeneity within that, and we do obviously represent the overall elevation of each grid, and because it influences climatic conditions, or is related to climatic conditions. But in terms of slope and aspect for each point, they represent a bigger area than that slope and aspect is particularly relevant to.
Okay, Joseph DeBebe has the next question, again with John's second portion. Any idea about sagebrush seed dormancy in relation to soil temperature and soil moisture?
Well, our review had some information about dormancy and suggested that they can last for a while and that they need to be stratified. For a while, I should say, a year or two is probably at least what we can feel reasonably confident about. So with the regeneration, one thing we found from that work was that at least if you're talking about an intact sagebrush stand or near a sagebrush stand, seed availability is generally not a problem. So the potential for dormancy was not an issue. We did include the need to be stratified in the model. So you had to experience cold conditions in order to be considered suitable for generation, but that typically is not a problem.
Okay, we are moving into questions for Bill. Did the Forbs literature review include plant community classifications? This is by David Tart.
The question is, did the Forbs literature review consider plant community classification? And we can, I guess by that, well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but we included all of the information that was in the publication. We didn't try to separate our data by, say, small-scale plant community classification information. We were summarizing really just for sagebrush.
Okay, David Darak has the next one. Are we talking about only native Forbs here?
Now, we sampled all Forbs, but for the most part, what our data represent are native perennial Forbs. We had few annual Forbs and a very small number of annual exotic Forbs, or annual or perennial exotic Forbs.
Okay, we're getting into Kyle's second presentation now for questions. For those publications cited in the webinar that are accepted or in review, what is the anticipated publication dates? And this is by Al Pfister.
The first one has been accepted, so I imagine it will be online within a month or less. The second one is a little uncertain, but several months out, just given that it's still in review and this is the first review it's gone through. And all that, the citation details for those papers are on my website. If you just Google Kyle Tomquist, it'll come up then. And as soon as that ecology paper is in press, published online, I'll have a link to it on my website.
Okay, Joseph DeBebe has another question. Does sagebrush mortality contribute to higher biomass that might stimulate more germination in growth plant species? And this is for John's last portion.
Well, the question is, does sagebrush mortality contribute to higher biomass that might facilitate regeneration? Is that correct?
Yep, more germination in growth plant species.
I think we don't know. I don't think we know how the system's going to respond to mortality. I think in terms of overall biomass, it's unlikely to have a positive effect. I think killing the dominants like that, at least for some decades afterwards, is likely to have overall less live biomass, perhaps only modest decreases in total live biomass. It is possible that as the sagebrush stop using resources, the water resources primarily, that you may have increases in some of the plants that were competing with them before. So perhaps grasses, perhaps forbs, perhaps other shrubs. And then also, as we noted when we were driving around out there a couple weeks ago, some species that are not so desirable, like salsola, can also at least appear to take off quite a bit. So I think there are some outcomes. I don't think we know a whole lot about what they are at this point. Yeah, but that's something we would like to consider, at least revisiting some of these sites periodically in coming years to get a handle on that.
Okay, Stacy James has the next question. Looking at only seedling survival, will bunch grasses or sagebrush be more hardy of the future dry, hot, long summers?
So the question, as I heard it, was, if summers are getting longer and hotter and drier, is that going to be, how is that going to influence the shrubs more or the bunch grasses more? I don't have a solid answer, and I'll let anybody else weigh in, but I would be, my bias or hypothesis might be that because the shrubs are already deeply rooted and they're relying on the deeply stored moisture, they might be more suited to survive that longer period than the grasses, which are more tuned to near surface moisture and perhaps also warm season moisture. But Bill and Kyle, if you guys want to provide your arm waving.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree that established sagebrush individuals may be able to tolerate drier conditions because they have adaptations to drought. However, what's uncertain is how seedling survival will be impacted, and I think that's the real key question. Soils will be wetter in the winter, and so that's going to keep germination perhaps as it currently is, but whether those seedlings, those newly established seedlings, will be able to survive the summer dry period is the real unknown, and given our modeling results suggest it's going to potentially be quite stressful for seedlings. So I think the canopy that exists there will fare okay, but regeneration is going to be really impacted negatively.
Okay, Larry Zuckerman is up next. Any chance for disease killing off large patches of sagebrush?
I think there's certainly a chance. I don't, that's not something that we're going to be able to address, but I would love to find someone who's a disease expert to take a look at these sites. I have to say that when you think about patchy patterns of mortality of a long-lived woody plant, I can't help but think about root pathogens like what I've experienced with armillaria, for example, in forests. But we don't see those kind of patterns. It's important to note that the patches we see do tend to be related to topographic position. So the patches where you have essentially nearly 100% mortality, and then outside of that patch it looks pretty good, those are pretty much almost always in those drainage bottoms. In the upland places where we're observing mortality, it tends to be much less patchy and much more consistent across a broad area. So you might have 50 to 80% mortality over a broad area, which doesn't look to me like it's a disease possibility. Now, I don't want to rule out defoliation events or diseases or anything else. It's certainly possible, but I'm not an expert in that. I don't know.
Okay, Larry does have a follow-up comment here. On reclamation in Jonah Field, some reclamation specialists better than others, some sites better than others, and in both large gas fields near Pinedale, many reclamation sites have had great success in initiating sagebrush restoration by seeding. Keep in mind low precipitation areas. So that was a comment. So I can go on to Stacy James's last question here.
Well, let me respond quickly. And I think that's absolutely true. And in fact, one of the things I think there's a ripe opportunity for trying to understand is what are the characteristics of sites where regeneration or recovery after well pads, what are the characteristics of the site that tend to be more successful, and maybe also what are the characteristics of the climatic conditions shortly after restoration is attempted that might be influencing the outcomes as well. And I think if we can find a way to tease out those factors, we might be able to at least focus our efforts on the sites that are most likely to be challenging and maybe let the good ones go, and also try to target our efforts at a time that's going to be most successful for restoration. So I certainly agree that there's a lot of variability in outcomes, and I just think it'd be worth our time to try to understand what are the drivers of that.
Great. Stacy James has a question. From the Forbs talk, are those percent cover graphics available in the upcoming Pennington et al. Paper or elsewhere? Great webinar.
They're, depending on which graphics you're talking about, there will be 2 papers from Victoria's master's thesis that we'll be submitting quite soon to the literature.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions we have from the webinar attendees, and I will let everybody know that we will be sending out an email with a link to the recording of this webinar when it's all done.
This is Steve. Thanks, Matt. And I just want to thank everybody on the webinar and those folks that came into the room at the regional office for spending the time with us today. And thanks the presenters. One of the things we keep on looking for is a way to translate those climate models, the global circulation ideas into biology and ecology. And so this is very sophisticated work, but it's, I think, the work that the service and others are going to need more and more of. So Kyle, Bill, John, thanks very much for coming in today and presenting this. And I think there's going to be a lot more thinking that goes on, probably a lot more questions by those in attendance as they think about this presentation. And I do encourage everybody to ask your colleagues who weren't able to attend to look at the recordings and maybe revisit portions of it yourself as we finish up this partnership with GS and the University of Wyoming. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.